Hey there, BleepinJeepers. It's Tyler. Got a quick video for you today. It's a real short one. What started as a simple stripped out wheel stud or stripped out lug nut turned into a huge can of worms on the back of my YJ right here. So I want to take you through exactly what happened. I have a custom axle in the rear end, and so this is kind of also a word of caution for you guys. If you buy a custom axle, there's some things that you may run into that you didn't anticipate. I certainly didn't anticipate a 30-minute repair like a wheel stud, a stripped out wheel stud, that turned into about a 2-week project. Let me show you what happened. So this is my Ford 9-inch rear end, and it was kind of a cascade of events that brought me to this point. This all started with a stripped out lug nut. And here I am with half the axle torn apart. So let me explain to you what happened. So really, to understand this, you need to understand the difference between a C-clip axle and a non-C-clip axle. So this is out of a Ford 8.8, and it is called a C-clip axle because once the axle shaft is inserted into the differential, a little C-clip, it's shaped like the letter C, slides over this into this groove, and that retains the axle shaft in the housing. There's some advantages and disadvantages to that. It's generally thought of as a disadvantage among off-roaders because if the axle shaft breaks in here, then there's now nothing left to retain the axle shaft in the housing, and the axle shaft will come shooting right out, and your whole wheel, your tire and axle shaft and everything will come right out of the housing, and you'll lose it right there on the trail. With a non-C-clip or semi-floating axle shaft like this, the retention isn't in here in the differential, the retention's down here at the flange. So the seal and bearing are pressed onto the shaft, and then there's this retaining ring, and it takes a huge amount of force, but you press this retaining ring down on here, and then this flange here bolts to the matching flange on the axle shaft. So the advantage of this design is if you bust your axle shaft back in here where they usually break, well, your shaft is still retained within the housing by that flange right there and by this ring that has the bearing and seal pressed onto it. So even though you can't drive the shaft anymore, you can at least get off the trail without your wheel falling off your vehicle. So these are generally thought of as an advantage over the C-clip style. But in this case, this is one of those weird coincidence, or one of those weird circumstances in which this actually turned out to be a disadvantage. So let me show you why. So if you look closely at this wheel stud, you'll see that it's actually a grade 8 bolt that is threaded into the flange, as opposed to normally your wheel studs are pressed in. They're an interference fit and they press in like that, and you see how there's a shoulder right here before the threads start, and that shoulder's a little oversized compared to the threads, and then there's an interference fit, it presses into this flange. That's pretty standard fare on axle shafts. This Ford 9-inch of mine is kind of a custom rear end that I bought off a guy that was putting it in a Roadrunner. So it's I'm not sure who made these shafts. The center section is a Curry center section, but for whatever reason, this guy decided to have his wheel studs threaded into the flange instead of pressed. Well, initially I thought that was an advantage because this would be easier to replace out on the trail. So I thought this would be an easier fix out on the trail because I wouldn't need a press to get the new wheel stud in. All I'd have to do is carry one of these grade 8 bolts and I could thread it right back in the hole. Well, you can see here there's a notch cut out of this flange. So you can see there's a flange here on the axle housing, and then the bearing and seal fit nice and tight in here, and then this flange bolts right to that axle flange. Actually, these go through like this. And there's some 3/4 inch nuts on this side, and that clamps this all together. It's really a strong design. And like I said, if I ever break the axle shaft, this will retain the axle within the housing so that I can drive off the trail. I'll be in 3-wheel drive, but I'll at least be able to get off the trail. So this is a good design. Just one of those weird quirks from a custom axle that it is really hard to anticipate, but one of those things you should be aware of if you're running custom parts like this. So here again are those grade 8 bolts that are threaded through the flange. There's the one I replaced. And I ran into a couple of problems here. So I couldn't get the old one out because you can see here, these are 2-inch bolts, and there's just not enough space here to get it out. So what I did is I cut the bad bolt off, threaded it out, and got it out. And then I knew I'd have to figure out something else to get the new one back in. Well, one of the problems I ran into are these bolts are kind of unicorns. They're a 2-inch long, 1/2-inch bolt with a fine pitch 20 pitch thread, but there's no shoulder on them. That means the threads go all the way to the head of the bolt. And I looked in every Tractor Supply, every auto parts place, everywhere I could find within 80-mile radius, and nobody had these kind of bolts, nor could they get them. I ended up having to go online, and I found some in eBay. I had to buy a 10-pack of them. But these, apparently a grade 8 bolt, they call these a tap bolt. But you can see the threads go all the way to the head. Normally a 2-inch bolt would have a shoulder right here, and the threads would stop at that shoulder. You would be surprised how hard it is to find these. So I'm glad I've got 10 of them. That's enough I could replace all of the wheel studs on my rear axle on both sides. So a few of these will be going in my toolkit. So that was the first problem that I ran into. Turns out maybe this isn't such an easy trail fix. And then of course the second problem was the interference with this flange. And I had two choices. I could either cut this retaining ring, cut the bearing, press all this off, have to replace the seal, the bearing, and the collar. And trust me, these are a major pain to get off. You have to notch them and whack them with a cold chisel, and I mean, it is just a major pain to get these off. Plus, this is a brand new bearing. I replaced this bearing and seal. I had a bad seal on this side, so I replaced this seal, bearing, and collar like a year ago, and there's no way I wanted to do that again. So my next option was to clearance this retaining flange so that I could get the bolt in there. I decided to go that route because now if any of the other wheel studs go bad, I can just rotate it until it lines up with the bad wheel stud, back it out, and replace it. The thing I had to watch though is this flange is all that holds the axle in. So there's a tremendous amount of lateral force on this when you're going around turns, or if the Jeep's loaded on the downhill side. There's a lot of pressure on this flange to hold that axle shaft in. So I did not want to weaken this, which, this has obviously taken some of the beef out of here. But it was the only other alternative I had to cutting the bearing and the seal and everything off, and I wasn't about to do that. So this side's notched now. If I ever blow another wheel or rip out another wheel stud, then I can replace it on this side without removing the whole shaft assembly and everything again. But if I ruin one on the other side, I'm going to be right back in the same boat, and this is not an easy trail repair. I mean, this is not really something I could repair on the trail. I guess I could limp out with, you know, four studs instead of 5. But, you know, worst case scenario, what if I broke a couple of them off? I'm not sure I could get out with only 3 wheel studs. So I think I've left enough meat down in here. You can see, I think I've left enough meat down in here that we're not going to compromise the strength of this too much. It's still, the seal is still going to fully seat in the retaining ring inside here. And I still got all 4 bolts all the way around, so I think I'm going to be okay. In fact, a lot of the aftermarket disc brake kits, this bracket is actually in the shape of a C anyway, so you can get it on and off without having to press the bearing and stuff off. So, and this thing, as you can see, this flange is almost 3/8 of an inch. In fact, it is 3/8 of an inch thick. So I think I got plenty of strength there, especially for the size of tires and stuff I'm running. All right, we're gonna get this all buttoned up, put back together, and the old YJ will be back on the road. So that's it, guys. We got her back together. I cannot believe that this stupid simple repair turned into this big a can of worms. I mean, it was one thing after another. But it goes to show that if you buy a custom axle from somebody and you didn't have any say in the way it was originally ordered or put together, you may have some problems that you weren't even aware of. I'm glad I found this in the comfort of my own shop and not out on the trail somewhere. That would have been really bad. So I'm probably going to pull the flange off the other side and clearance it just in case. But thanks for watching. I know this was a short one, but I'll see you guys again soon. If you want to, you can always support us on Patreon. We really appreciate that. That helps us keep this kind of content coming. Also, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.